Master your money, free your future. Welcome to Budget for Life. My name is Jeremy. I'm not a professional YouTuber. I'm a financial advisor, but this video is not financial advice. In this video, I'm going to try to look at GameStop's hardware sales. What happened? How did they go from 592 million in hardware and accessory sales in Q2 down to 367 million in Q3, particularly when I thought they would be at 605 or something, right? I was way off. How does this happen to where post Switch 2, they're selling 367 million when before the Switch 2 came out, they sold 345 million? How does this happen? Can we look at Nintendo's financials as well as GameStop's financials in hindsight, using Q1 and Q2, like could we have ended up with a better estimate for GameStop's Q3? Can we learn from that mistake and better inform our modeling for Q4 and beyond? Or will we find that there's something deeply concerning with the Switch 2 demand or deeply concerning with GameStop's relative positioning in the video game industry, right? Let's dive into it. And before I do, just want to say thanks so much to those who have joined the channel, that have subscribed, that have watched. Thank you for the watch time. All the earnings of the channel go to DRS Book GME shares. So I appreciate the support a lot. Um, and my most recent computer share, whatever, DRS request finally went through. They rejected it like two times. Funny business going on. But it went through. So we've locked up 34 shares together, and the Budget for Life Infinity Pool continues to grow. Okay, so hardware. So when we look at Nintendo, we see that so Nintendo's Q3 comes out before GameStop's Q3 because Nintendo's Q3 is the normal Q3. It's July, August, September. July, August, September. That's Nintendo's second quarter. GameStop second quarter is um what is it? August, September, October. So when we think about GameStop's Q2 for Nintendo and for hardware, for everything, right? The Switch 2 came out on June 5th. June 5th. So GameStop had all of June and July included in their quarter two sales. Nintendo only had June. They did not sell any Switches in April. They did not sell any Switches in May. So when we think about their financials, right, their sales in the Americas, they go from 98 million yen in their Q1, right, January, February, March, to 232 million yen in their second quarter, which was April, May, June. But we can assume that GameStop's jump from Q1 to Q2 proportionally is probably even higher as far as it relates to the impact of the Switch release because GameStop had all of June and July compared to their Q1 of February, March, April did not include any Switch 2 sales. So their Q1, just like Nintendo's Q1, included no Switch sales, Switch 2 sales, but GameStop's Q2 included 2 months of Switch 2 sales versus only 1 month of Switch 2 sales for Nintendo. But what is that percent bump Q1 to Q2 that Nintendo had in the Americas? About 232 minus 98, $134 million bump or a 137% increase from Q1 to Q2. What was GameStop's increase? You would expect it to maybe even be a little bit more dramatic. Um, but so 130, let's just jot this down over here. Nintendo Q1 to Q2, Americas 136% or 137%, geez, increase. GameStop's Q1 to Q2, you've got 592 minus 345, which is 247 million, divided by 345 is 72%. GameStop's 72%. But GameStop includes accessories with their hardware. So that's one, why would GameStop underperform Nintendo's quarter over quarter numbers? One reason is GameStop has used hardware, which is not going to dramatically change based on the Switch 2, right? Some amount of this 103.45 is used hardware, and some amount of this 345 is accessories. And we actually have a pretty good idea of how much because we can solve for their total gross margin. So when you think about their hardware business in Q1, of that 345, likely about 140 million of that was actually new consoles, right? Which Nintendo, obviously they sell games as well. So, you know, I don't know if they distill out their financials from their different segments. Let's see if they do. Here's their balance sheet, liabilities. They just have sales. They really not break it out. It's so interesting. Does Nintendo break out Switch 2 sales from video game sales? Well, show it to me. Show it to me. Unit sales. Games like Mario Kart World are bundled with hardware. I don't see any of it. Like, what am I missing? What am I what am I missing, Nintendo? Nintendo investor relations, hardware sales. Tell me something, Nintendo. As of September, so this was after their Q2. Okay, dedicated video game. Well, that's kind of interesting that they break it down like that. That's nice. But will you show it to me quarter over quarter? This is just current. Unit sale. Oh, okay. Nintendo Switch hardware. Oh, this is just year over year. Oh, there you go, quarterly. Oh, beautiful. Beautiful. This is a little bit better for us to look at. So they sold, again, you can see it here. No Switches in Q1. They sold 508, 582,000 units. Can you show it to me in revenue? No. Switch to 208. So they'll break it down by region, which is nice. Anyways, but I mean, whatever. You know what they're selling them for. Ah, is what it is. Nintendo Switch quarterly broken down by region. Y'all learning anything yet? Um, okay, going back to what we're talking about. GameStop Q1 new consoles was 140 million approximately, and in Q2, if you solve for their margins, approximately 350 million. So 350 minus 140 is 210 divided by 140 is 150%. So total hardware increased by 72%, but GameStop's new console was actually up by 150%, which is in line with what you would expect. You would expect GameStop to increase more substantially Q1 to Q2 because you would expect that they sold more in Q2 proportionally of Switch 2 sales than Nintendo did because GameStop's Q2 included June and July, right? But if we run this again for just the Switch sales, we don't have a starting point to go with, so we can't really look at the like quarter over quarter. But when we think about Q2 to Q3, we'll be able to glean from that um, a little bit more clearly. How much do how much do these sell for? How much does I guess they're not really gonna literally. So they sold units in, I'm just doing it all over again. Total units in Q2 was 582,000, which is what in sales Nintendo make from Switch 2 in Q2. See, I don't know if Google's accurate with this. I need to learn how to read Nintendo's um, reports better. That's the sales data we're already looking at. This is what came out after their Q2 numbers. Hmm. In total, they've sold 10.3 million units. That's why I don't understand what am I getting right here that says 582,000 units. Like I don't understand how Nintendo is breaking this down. Oh, it's in thousands probably. No, Nintendo Switch quarterly. Is it in hundreds? Oh, it's 582, 10,000 units. Okay, so 582,000 times 10. Thank you. Geez, that was confusing. Okay, they sold 5.8 million Switches in Q2 and 4.5 million in Q3. Their total revenue quarter over quarter in the Americas went up by 137%. How much of that Switch 2 happened in the Americas? 208,000, 10,000 units happened in the Americas. So about 2 million Switches were sold in the United States. And how much does the Nintendo Switch 2 cost 449. Okay. I'm sure Nintendo probably sells them for slightly less, but GameStop probably sells them for 449 on average. If if Nintendo sold 2 million units, that means they made $933 million in America's sales. If GameStop knew, like if the Switch 2 is the primary reason that GameStop's hardware jumped by 250 million quarter over quarter, and again, if new consoles rose by 210 million, and that is the Switch, right? 210 is kind of like how much did GameStop sell during July, right? Is kind of the question. Because if GameStop, anyways, that 210 that GameStop sold of Switch 2s, if their quarter lined up with Nintendo, you would say 210 divided by 934, GameStop has 22% of the market share for Switches in America, which we know is not true. Like we know of this 208,000, the 2 million sold in June, right? 2 million of that, all of that 208 sold in June, right? Of the Switch 2, those 2 million units. How much of this 160 was sold in July? Or in other words, another two different ways to kind of solve for how do we use Nintendo sales as a GameStop proxy? One being, let's approximate how much of this happened in July, combine that together with Nintendo's basically June numbers to give like for like GameStop versus Nintendo. The other way is to backwards say how much of the market share does GameStop have, right? Like how much of the America's video game console market does GameStop own? 2.2%. I mean, that's crazy. Okay, 10 to 15% of new console sales estimated. 10 to 15% estimated. If you took that, if you took the high end of that, then you would say that the 210, jeez, GameStop, GameStop's America's market share for new consoles. I think it's probably closer to 10% of America's. If it's 10 to 15% of US, it's maybe 10% of all the Americas because there's South America, right? And Canada and Mexico, right? So let's say like GameStop's market share for new consoles is approximately 10%. Nintendo's US consoles, the Switch 2, 208, 2 million. Yeah, so anyways, Nintendo, there's so many factors here. Nintendo June Switch sales 934 million. Nintendo July through August. No, September is, oh geez, 160, 160 times 10,000, 1.6 million times 449 is 718 million. So this quarter over quarter drop, you would expect to be more severe for GameStop. Like you would expect GameStop's bump Q1 to Q2 to be more intense than Nintendo's bump because they included June, or sorry, included July. You would also expect GameStop's drop Q2 to Q3 to be more severe than Nintendo's drop because presumably July still included a decent amount of that pent-up demand for Switch 2, right? Which is included in Nintendo's Q2, but not included in GameStop's Q2. And holiday sales probably don't really start till November. Like, what if October is not really such a big month for um for Switch? 19 minus AW 18 divided by AW 18. So Switch 2 sales fell 23% quarter over quarter. How much of that do you think happened in July? How much of this 718? Like if you were to say like July, August, September, like maybe 40% happened in July, maybe. Right, this is all just back of the napkin, right? Can we improve on this? If y'all have thoughts, if you're watching through this, try to learn, try to think, pop up in the comments. Like maybe 40% of Nintendo's Q3 Switch sales happen in July, and then maybe it's 30 and 30 for August and September, right? Huge first month, still a pretty stinking huge second month, and then maybe a slight tapering off, like maybe it's 30, 32 and 28, right? Equals 0.32 times AW18 equals 0.28 times AW. If you add this together, there you go, 718. So if you adjust this as it relates to GameStop, like GameStop's portion of Nintendo's June plus Nintendo's July, so this is how much approximately Nintendo sold in June and July of Switch 2s in the Americas. If we assume that GameStop's US position is 15%-ish or 14% of new console distribution, then their total Americas is 10%, June and July. Then you would say take 10% of this number, and you would say they did 122 million in Switch 2 sales during their Q1 if they have 10%, which I've modeled that they did basically 350 minus 140, like 210 basically. If 10 of that is just people buying other stuff also because Switch 2 and it's fun to buy stuff, sure. But I have basically 200 million coming from GameStop, which what is 200 million divided by AW24? That would be 16%. Helps likely share of Nintendo's America's distribution. So I would say Google's a little bit low on the 10 to 15%. It's probably maybe more like 16% of all of America's. Because that 200 million number is like just about rock solid. I mean, it's not like literally rock solid. It could maybe be 190, could even be 180. But like this bump, $250 million dollars more of hardware sales happened, right? From GameStop. So if you don't think this is Switch 2, like whatever amount of that was not Switch 2, then you have to think like controllers went absolutely bonanzas, right? And I modeled a from 129 to 162, right? I already have modeled a whatever that is, 32 million, almost $33 million increase in accessory sales. And again, could it be more than that? Sure, but you still have to make it make sense with their total margins. And we know the margins within a like a pretty accurate range, you know. But based on this math that we're doing, I'm thinking accessories probably was a little larger portion of the hardware 592 for probably a little bit lower margin, and that new consoles were not quite as high. Like I wonder if this is like I modeled a 35% increase, but if you make this 40% and say they only had 36% margins, then you end up warmer. I think that's probably like closer to accurate. And then you just say they made a tiny bit more or oh, a tiny bit less actually margin on their new consoles. There you go. So there's another way you could solve for the 283. Say maybe new consoles is only 330, maybe controllers is actually, 50 million of controllers. Even then, you still are at 190 of Switch 2 sales. Coming back to here, that would get you at 15%. Right, if it's 10%, then GameStop did 122. There's almost no way that GameStop only did 122 million though of hardware of Switch 2. Like for this number to be 260-ish is uh is it's going to be hard for that. Like you would have to bake in like 7% margins or something and margins collapsing on their used consoles or something. Like it would just be hard to math that out. Anyways, okay, there's too much going on. We got to slow this down. Nintendo Q2 to Q3 America's total sales, but America's um Q2 sales again dropped 23%, but would be more basically the question is, did October do like what would you expect October to do in comparison to July? Like, do you think the demand for Switch 2 would be higher in July than it would be in October? I would think yes. Like, I would think the demand is probably higher than August, but probably lower than July. Like maybe 245 or 250, let's say 250. There's a little bit of pull forward holiday stuff, but I think mostly it's going to happen in November, December. So if, like when we're thinking about GameStop's quarter over quarter, GameStop's Q1, we're talking about for the Switch 2 specifically, and really, I mean, we could just say for their total hardware grew 72%. New consoles grew, well, actually now less than 150%. Let's try to math that out. Equals, where's Q2? This minus this divided by this. This is actually kind of crazy. Nintendo's Q1 to Q2 America's sales grew 137%. That's based on this graph right here, right? 98 to 231 or 232. Nintendo's Q1 to Q2 sales grew 135%, 137%. GameStop's new console sales grew 135%. I mean, that's looking pretty helpful. It's looking pretty helpful so far. Nintendo's Q2 to Q3 total. Let's just look at their total. This can be the total line over here. In the Americas was 217 minus 232 divided by 232 was a 6.5% drop. But their Switch 2 dropped 23%. So they sold a lot more games in Q3, but they sold way fewer Switches, which is what we saw, right? Software Q2 to Q3 actually grew pretty meaningfully, but hardware came down sharply. It still ends up in a total decrease, right? The total between hardware and software together went from 744 to 565. But the hardware specifically came down way sharper. And part of that sharpness is exacerbated by the fact that, again, GameStop's Q1 includes Q Nintendo's June and July. So what's like the Nintendo equivalent? Like if Nintendo was June and July, Q1 would be these two numbers together, right? Q2 would be the sum of these three numbers. And so the decrease would be much more dramatic. AZ19 minus AZ18 divided by AZ18. Nintendo would have seen a 44% decline in approximately. So like we know these numbers. October is the only guess here. All these numbers are like well, I should say we know the total number for Q3. We know Nintendo's total switches for Q2. We know their total switches for Q3 in the Americas, right? So Nintendo's Americas quarter over quarter, if you're to approximate how much of their Q3 happened in July, right? And how much approximately would they make in October? Then you have, okay, Q1 switch Americas is this, Q2 switch Americas is that. That's a 44% drop. GameStop, if you take their Q2 331, like you basically if you adjust Nintendo to reflect GameStop's quarters, then we could have taken this approximation and said, I wonder if GameStop's hardware, their new console sales will drop 44%, as well as maybe their accessories, but maybe their accessories wouldn't drop quite as sharply. Let's just see, 330.7, or I should take Q3's approximation. 154, or I guess I should say, sorry, without having Q3's numbers, we could have taken 330.7 and said, what if it goes down by 56%, right? Or if you take 56% of this number, then you would say GameStop probably has a 44% decline, just like approximately Nintendo did. If you if you take that 44% decline, you would have had 185 for GameStop's new console sales, which currently I have it modeled at 155. But that would have been much warmer than where I was off the jump. But here's the other thing is store closures, right? Store closures. Hardware sales per store is actually higher, I mean, meaningfully higher than it was a year ago, right? And in Q3, meaningfully higher than it was in Q1. So you look at the total hardware numbers and you're thinking, man, you got the Switch 2 out here and you still barely did more than Q1. It's like, well, if you adjust for store closures, right? They've got 1,000 fewer stores than where they started the year at. Their sales per store of hardware sales, 0.4% or zero point 0.4 divided by 0.14, sorry, 0.04. Sales per store is actually up 29% from Q1 to Q3. But look at their sales per store number, right? $260,000 in hardware sales per store in Q2, 180 in Q3. So if you take that 180 divided by 260, or sorry, the difference is zero point zero 0.08 divided by 0.26. That's a 31% drop in hardware sales per store, which is why you see the total, anyways, 31% drop in hardware sales per store, which is less mild than the 44% total drop. Hmm. I'm gonna have to make a part two of this video. I'm not trying to model Q4 yet. I'm trying to learn from Q1 to Q3 so that when Nintendo's Q4 numbers come out, we can actually have a really meaningfully more accurate estimate for GameStop's hardware sales. We're definitely getting some clues here. Definitely getting some clues. If you're watching this, watch it again and help me out. Learn with me, right? Of course, these are approximations, right? You could say, what if July was actually, still a huge portion, right? And that August and that August was another big chunk, right? 35, 45. Let's leave these at 32 and 28 actually. If July was an even bigger month for the Switch, then that decline is even more apparent. If you take um, July and say that after June, it was all just, basically stable, right? 33, 33, and 33. Let's put 30, 34 in July. Then still you'd have a 38% drop, like Nintendo's 23% drop from Q1 from Q2 to Q3 would still imply a 39% drop in GameStop's Q1 to Q2, right? But most likely July did have much more Switch sales than August and October, right? Maybe as much as 45% of the month, which basically leaves what? 25 and 25 or like 30 and 25, which means it could be as much as like a 50% drop, which again, GameStop's total, like again, if you were to take Q2 new consoles and if like take a 50% drop, you'd say it could be as low as 165 in total sales. But they came in at 154, right? And that's where the store count comes in as the added layer. It's like, well, if their total sales would be expected to come down by 49%, but they have 10% fewer stores, then you would basically take that, 331 times, like net out that 49% drop, that becomes 169. But then what is that store closure difference on a percent basis? A 7% reduction in stores. So you would take that 168.81, did that our best estimate of Q2, right? You adjust Nintendo's Switch sales to reflect GameStop's quarters, right? If you put June and July of Nintendo Switch sales together, and then you take August, September, October, right? You would get a 49% decline in Nintendo's Switch sales. If GameStop reflects that same 49% decline from 330.7, you would expect that they would have 168.81 in Q1. But then if you say They should also expect a 7% decline based on their stores closing. Then you would take the 168, say times 0.93, you would end up with an estimate of 157 million for GameStop's new consoles. They ended up at 154. So again, without using GameStop's Q3 numbers, without having their numbers, obviously you would have to approximate how many stores they closed. So you wouldn't have that level of clarity. Is it 160 or is it less? But they'd be closing stores, right? Look, you can see that like they're closing stores, right? Um, so they're going to close some. So again, you adjust for that on top of adjusting for Nintendo's quarters, and I could have had a $157 million target for GameStop's new console sales, which ultimately would have clued in that, hey, used and accessories are also coming down. So no matter what, like I still would have ended up high, but I could have been within 5% accuracy on a projection um, easily. Not easily. I mean, this is hard work over here. This is hard work that we're doing over here, but I'm excited to continue to dive into this because I think it could be really informative for giving us a better clue for Q4 and moving forward, right? And ultimately, it helps paint a picture that the hardware sales um, did not really like collapse. They just had the Switch just had a huge launch, like a huge launch. And if the Switch sales are collapsing, we'll see that in Nintendo's Q4. Like we will see Nintendo's Q4 before GameStop reports. So we'll know, man, is the Switch 2 demand really actually waning, or is it continuing to grow as expected and just happened to have an absurdly large first period of sales, first month of sales, right? Again, on Nintendo's end, this was 1 month of Switch sales. 1 month did more than the next 3 months combined. Does that mean that there's no demand for the Switch 2? No, it means there was a ton of pent-up demand for Switch 2. And Nintendo says as much as they adjusted like when they came out with these numbers, they adjusted their earnings estimates higher. Like they adjusted their Q4 to be an even higher number than what they expected before they had gotten these numbers. So, um, again, does it imply a huge implosion of Switch demand? Not really. It implies that there was huge pent up Switch demand. Could we have ended up with a much more accurate number if we were going from the ground up using Nintendo sales as a barometer and GameStop store count as a barometer, rather than how I got messed up was looking at quarter over quarter and year over year and historical trends. And all of that goes out the window when something happens that's never been seen in history, which is the pent up demand for Switch 2. So all of the quarter over quarter relative numbers, as it related specifically to the Switch 2 sales, were just simply not fundamentally sound, um, because we've never seen this much pent up demand. So to imagine that that demand will continue to rise despite evidence from Nintendo saying, hey, this was a huge spike in week one, month one, we have to get it right now, not a floor that's going to continue exploding from here. This was a huge pent up demand that then is going to cool off into normal demand and then, of course, continue to grow along with the expected lifespan of a console cycle, which is basically 4 years of consecutive growth. Um, Whether that ends up happening or if history continues to defy us in different ways, we'll see. But a grounds up analysis of GameStop's hardware, um, would have certainly gotten us within a 5% accuracy. Again, without even having Q3, just looking at Nintendo's numbers and what we knew from GameStop's numbers, we could have been pretty stinking close. All right. If you learn anything in this video, let me know. Anything else you want to add to the conversation? I will clean this stuff up and move it somewhere else in the spreadsheet later. But if there's anything else you want to talk about as far as GameStop's market share and thinking about Nintendo's sales and how to model GameStop sales, again, drop in the comments. Thank you again to all those who have joined the channel. Thank you to the subscribers to the channel. That's all I got for you today. I will see you in the next one.